All right, good evening. Just over a month ago, Hillard Heintze came and presented their report, and we're using that as a starting point for some changes and some ongoing review. So we were going to give an update tonight. And I will start with, there's been some discussion with regards to the rifle safety involved in some of the, that was with Officer Ruff back to the arrest on April 10th. That matter was referred back to Hillard Heintze to at least say, hey, would you take a look at this? This was, I think it should be noticed, this piece, I guess, was outside of the original scope. They actually kicked it back to us as we believe this is a training issue. So I've assigned that to firearms staff for review and or remedial training. So that I just wanted to touch base with the council on where that particular issue stood. Speaking of training, one of the, or I guess a couple of the areas that have come up with regards to some of the recommendations with regards to the implicit bias and or de-escalation. So I'm going to speak to that right now. Then specifically with regards to training. Generally speaking, there are two main areas where the Urbana police officers receive training. We usually have an annual in-service training, which is an 8-hour chunk of time, usually broken up into a couple of 4-hour blocks. We had initially had this scheduled for, that usually comes up in the springtime, but with the pandemic, we had postponed that in an effort to make sure we could do this under new pandemic rules. As a matter of fact, starting tomorrow, we'll begin the in-person instruction with our in-service training. That first block was the will be on the classroom instruction. Some of that will be procedures and operations, things like evidence and processing and the updates of those issues. Some updates from the state's attorney's office, but the biggest chunk will actually be implicit bias training. And we'll actually have devoted 2 hours of time for that classroom block of instruction that will occur in October. The second 4-hour block that the officers will receive is now currently scheduled for November. And that's actually where we're going to be prioritizing de-escalation training. And in that particular case, we're actually going to take, that's usually more hands-on scenario-based training. We're actually going to take a 1 hour of that to review the de-escalation techniques and have some actual classroom time there. We will then move and shift into 3 hours of scenario-based hands-on training, where the officers will get an opportunity to, okay, take these techniques that we've reviewed, this classroom, and now we're going to actually use that for these scenarios and in some hands-on training. And how do we apply that and move forward in those areas? So that's coming up in November. With regards to the other big area outside of how we train officers in-house, and the nice thing about the in-house is that we get all of the officers trained. I won't say always 100%, but all the officers can get to those based on how the scheduling works. The other area that we receive a lot of training is through the mobile training unit. The state's divided. You might have heard me say this into various regions. We're in mobile training unit 12. And that they actually just last week reopened post-pandemic as well with some in-person training. And I actually attended 2 classes, one class police and minority relations and another class on tactical de-escalation techniques. And in that particular, in those classes, it was actually the same instructor taught both days. Very solid instructor. Matter of fact, we've already had some conversations in-house about seeing about whether we can bring him here to do something one-on-one. Typically one on this for our officers and or perhaps others. Typically when we have mobile training unit classes, it's sort of as we can manage the street, staffing, detective staffing, and those types of issues. So we might get 4 to 6 officers at a time. And a matter of fact, I think that's what we had last week at both of those particular trainings. So some officers get that particular training and obviously some haven't. And over the course of time, if this instructor comes back in 6 months, we'll send a few more. That's why we're exploring perhaps some other ways of bringing this instructor even back to focus exclusively on Urbana. with his areas of expertise.